Welcome to the Non-Anxious Leader Family Systems Basics. This is part one of a three-part presentation on understanding family process. And as I have begun each of our presentations, I start with Kierkegaard's quote, "Now, Lord, with your help, I shall become myself." The essence of family systems theory is doing our own emotional work so that we can become better differentiated, and in so doing, our inputs into the family system are healthy and enable others to grow healthier as well. That leads to Friedman's basic concept of leadership through self-differentiation is our ability to take responsibility for our own goals while staying in touch with the rest of the system, whether that's our family or the church. If we can do that, in other words, if we can take our emotional stands where we say, I believe this, or I think this is where we need to go as an organization, or I think this is what we ought to do. If we can take those stands where we're taking responsibility for what we believe while staying emotionally connected to everyone else, then there's a good chance that people will follow. And this is most important in terms of staying emotionally connected when it comes to the resistors, because there will be resistance. That's a normal part of any change in a family system as we understand the principle of homeostasis. So there will be resistance. The question is, will the leader be willing to stay in touch emotionally, stay emotionally connected with the resistors? That doesn't mean you placate, doesn't mean you adapt in terms of giving in. It just means that as a leader, you're willing to stay connected emotionally and give them emotional space to follow. One of Friedman's important concepts in understanding family process and family systems theory is that we always focus on process, not content. And the concepts that we'll cover in the next three presentations will help us to understand that process. But when we look at what's going on in a family system or a church system, you can almost fill in the blank with the content. The content is irrelevant. So whether Junior's not performing in school, or somebody's dealing with an alcohol or drug problem, or there's conflict, or whether it's in the church, somebody's complaining about the pastor, or the hymns that are being selected, or the kitchen committee's gone wild, it doesn't really matter what the content is. The focus is on what's going on process-wise, and more importantly, as leaders, to try not to argue content with people, but to understand the process and be a non-anxious presence. That will unfold. How we do that will unfold over these next several sessions. We're going to cover three concepts today: emotional distance, loss and replacement, and chronic conditions. Emotional distance is tricky because you can either be too close or too distant from somebody emotionally, and in either case, the same problems can result. When you're too close to somebody, what it usually means is that one person is over-functioning anxiously in another's emotional space. This is typically true with a parent and a child, but could also be true with even adults in a family system or in a church. There's usually one of two responses when they're too close emotionally. There's conflict, because the one who's being overfunctioned on just fights back all the time, and that's called a reactive response. Or there is an adaptive response where the one who's being overfunctioned upon just goes along without taking their own emotional stance. The opposite end of the spectrum is being distant or cut off, and that's just where there is no connection emotionally, where one or both of the parties in the relationship have withdrawn, and they don't take emotional stands with each other. There's no anxiety. They're just not connected at all, and we call that cut off. So emotional distance is not solved by physical distance. So when two people are too close, and one person can't take it and they move across the country, that doesn't solve the problem. There's still a problem that they have not figured out how to take an emotional stand in a non-anxious way. It's just maybe making the problem less frequent because they're not as with the person as often. So emotional distance is not solved by physical distance. And it is really a function of self-differentiation. So the more self-differentiated two people are, the more appropriate their emotional distance will be. And that is a flexible and resilient thing. If two people are both self-differentiated, at times they might appear very close, and at other times they might appear distant, but it's really not that they are distant emotionally. It's just that the circumstances in their lives are kind of pulling them away from each other emotionally, and sometimes putting them back together, more closely together. But in either case, it's a healthy distance because there's not a lot of anxiety, conflict, reactive feedback, or adaptation where one person calls all the shots for the other. Really, emotional distance has to do with the capacity to define one's own self while controlling one's own reactive mechanisms. So think about in a relationship, your ability to say, this is who I am, this is what I believe, and if somebody else says something that's different or disagrees with you, that you don't start the blaming you. How can you? Well, that's, you're never right, or you're always causing me problems. So when you can control your reactive mechanisms while at the same time defining yourself, taking your own emotional stands, you have a better chance of creating healthy emotional distance. And the quickest way to destroy emotional distance is to overfunction anxiously in another's space. So if you're a parent, you may be able to relate to that sentence. There are times when a child will do things that makes you really anxious and you want to overfunction in their space. And what that does is that essentially shuts down, it closes off the emotional distance, so there's virtually none left, and it gives the child no space to develop their own capacity for emotional stands. The concept of loss and replacement has to do with change in a family, and essentially any change represents a loss. Even a good change, for example, a marriage is a loss of singleness, or a promotion is a loss of an old job. And of course, there are also losses that are painful, such as death and breakups of relationships. But to the extent that a family rushes to replace loss, its pain will be lessened, but so will the potential for change that the loss made possible. Replacement is a function of grief. Loss, whether it's a good kind of loss or a painful kind of loss, does result in grief of some kind, because something has changed, and it is to the extent that we replace is a function of the residue of the relationship that was lost. So, for example, if the patriarch and the family dies and the matriarch remarries quickly, that is a replacement for the matriarch of the family, to have somebody who is going to replace that relationship without having the chance to grieve and come to terms with the lost relationship. The residue from unworked out relationships that we bring into our current relationship will always affect our ability to function. So if I have unworked out relationships with other people in my life, I bring those into every other relationship that I have. I have a good example of there was a woman I was counseling one time, and she and her mother were they were fused. The mother was always calling the shots, and the daughter was very adaptive. She never argued, but then she started having marital problems, and the marital problems made her the identified patient. And as we started to look at her family of origin, what we found was that this woman was born a month after her grandfather had died. Her mother's father had died, and her mother had been very close to this woman's grandfather. Her mother had been close to her own father, and so this loss, she didn't have a chance to deal with the grief and resolve that relationship, and the daughter just became the replacement for it. And it took really literally the daughter, when she was in her mid-20s, until she was able to deal with the fact that she was the replacement for her mother's loss. So to the extent that a family system replaces a loss quickly, they have not worked out, they've not resolved the pain of that loss and the potential change, the potential growth, because anytime there's pain, it's also an opportunity for growth. And when we have healthy grief and we work through the loss, then we're able to actually grow in our emotional capacity. But when we replace quickly, we actually diminish our emotional capacity. And then finally, chronic conditions. If a family problem is chronic, that is perpetual or recurrent, there has to be some kind of feedback, and that's either reactive or adaptive, somewhere in the system to sustain it. So the reactive feedback would be, every time that somebody comes home mad from work, and they start taking it out on their family, then there's reactive feedback. There is, if I come home and I've had a bad day at work and I start yelling at my wife, and she starts yelling back at me, because the tone that I give her makes her remember when, or makes her think of when her dad used to yell at her, and that relationship has not been worked out, then that will become a recurring problem. Now, this is a hypothetical, so don't go saying that this happens with our family and that we have these kinds of unworked out relationships, although we all have unworked out relationships. But see, it's that reactive feedback that will cause that to occur over and over again. The same for adaptive feedback. So if I were to come home and yell, and my wife, her unworked out relationship with her father was that she always just swallowed it. She just took it. She didn't, she swallowed her pride and didn't say anything, and didn't take an emotional stand. That in itself will end up being a chronic problem. And the real issue is that I've got a problem with work. I can't deal with some of my peers, and I'm not able to take emotional stands at work, and I'm triangling my wife. And so that will become a chronic problem. And the way it will sustain itself is by me yelling at my spouse and then getting the kind of feedback that will sustain that pattern over and over again. And so I would be willing to say that most family systems have some kind of chronic condition. And if you were to think about a chronic condition where this dance, I like to say this dance occurs on a regular basis, and it might be weeks or months between occurrences, but there's a dance that goes on, and it will start with a particular trigger, and one person will say one thing, and then there will be either reactive or adaptive feedback, and then this spiral occurs. And so you can recognize that. In fact, when I am working with clients and families of origin, I will often, we'll go through this and we'll talk about that, because you can predict what's going to happen. You can identify the first step and the next step, and the next, because there's a pattern that occurs. It's a chronic condition. And the reason it occurs is because there's reactive or adaptive feedback. So the quickest way for something to change in that system would be for the person who's providing the feedback to stop giving the feedback. So in the example I gave where my wife was being triangled between me and my problems at work, the quickest way for her would be to be a non-anxious presence, to take her own emotional stands. You know, when you pick a fight, if you don't get the fight, you go looking somewhere else. And so it's kind of like that. When you triangle somebody in, if they are a non-anxious presence, if they can be self-differentiated and not be reactive or adaptive, they can they actually take themselves out of the triangle, and then you know, I got to go deal with my own issue. So that's how chronic conditions are perpetuated. And as we start to look at family process more deeply, we'll look at how we can be the ones to get out of the triangles. In the next session, session 2, we'll cover the concepts of pain and responsibility, paradox and playfulness, and secrets and systems. And that's it for now.